Hi, I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Glad you can join us today for a timely and I think what's likely to be a really interesting conversation, grading Trump's first 100 days on education. We're at that mark. FDR, was the first president who really gave rise to the 100-day leitmotif. But Trump has shattered all kinds of records, less in terms of what he's done on Capitol Hill, and much more with what he's done through executive orders and executive activity. We're going to try to make sense of all of this, try to give you a sense of what's going well, what's not going well, and what it all means. And with us, I've got what I what I can only describe as the best possible set of folks to help us figure it out. We've got Bob Eitel, president of the Defense of Freedom Institute, Nikki Neely, the president of Defending Education, formerly Parents Defending Education, but they've just broadened their mission to higher ed, so defending education. Mike Petrilli, the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, and Andy Rotherham, co-founder at Bellwether. Bellwether Partners, Andy, is that right?
We dropped the partners. Everyone's got to do some belt tightening in this economy. So just Bellwether.
Yeah, glad to see you guys stepping up. For those of you who want to share questions throughout, you can email questions to Sean Doolan, SEAN Doolan, DOOLAN at AEI.org, or you can post at X with hashtag AEI Trump 100 days. Feels like 1,000 days, but that's AEI Trump 100 days. We're going to do is I'm going to throw a handful of kickoff questions to our panel, and then we're going to open it up and just kind of try to make sense of where we are and what we've seen. Nikki, first question. What's gone well in the Trump administration's first 100 days?
The president has framed out a very ambitious agenda through his executive orders. And so I think, we keep reading the phrase promises made, promises kept. I mean, certainly on the issue of women and girls in sports, on gender issues, he has delivered big on that. I think it was a big issue that came up during the course of the election. Obviously, the ads, he's for you, Kamala is for they, them. I think, that is something that has been delivered on. School choice also is an issue that, obviously was on everybody's mind. And so there were executive orders about that. That being said, I mean, let's remember executive orders do not have the force of law. And it's funny because I think back to when, we were talking about Obama governing with like a pen and a phone. I mean, now it's like Sharpie and like tweet. And so there's the agenda, and then there's going to be the how do we actually codify and execute that? And I think those are two very, very different things.
Bob, same question. First 100 days, what's gone right?
Well, I just think as a general matter that the president has knocked his opponents off balance for now, perhaps until now. You see some semblance of the opposition beginning to get their footing. But during that first 100 days, Democrats in Congress have been muted and rendered ineffectual. Elite institutions of higher education have faced the loss of billions in federally funded contracts and grants. Investigations focused on anti-Semitism, harassment that violates Title VI of the Civil Rights Act have been commenced at scores of colleges. The K-12 public education establishment in the states is facing the loss or the severe reduction of the public sector bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., i.e. the U.S. Department of Education, which is looking at a 50% reorientation of programs to banish DEI, as well as plans to dismantle the department. The Education Department has also made aggressive moves to bring Title IX back to its proper place based on the text, history, structure, purpose of the law, which is that it prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, not gender identity. Earlier this month, the department has started aggressive moves to start collecting payments on student loans, which has not happened since March of 2020, putting debtors into default, collection efforts, all of that. And then earlier this month, which some people may have missed with all this other activity, is the department has announced, and actually is doing this week, it's a initial efforts to start negotiated rulemaking under the Higher Education Act, which will impact a whole host of issues from student loans to accreditation. So it's been impactful. There's a lot more to unpack, obviously, from all that, but yes, it's been eventful.
So eventful. So I think it's safe to say that's an understatement, what you just listed.
Yes.
Andy, first 100 days, what's gone well for the Trump administration?
All right. Well, I think everybody would agree on eventful. How positive the events are is probably where the disagreement is. I mean, I'll start like there. Look, government is sprawling and complicated. The education department is sprawling and complicated. So they've done some small things. I mean, they corrected a rule on CTE that a lot of the groups didn't like. A lot of the DC-based CTE groups representing CTE educators didn't like the flexibility that they're trying to emphasize that you can use some federal dollars for direct services. I mean, those things are those things are good. I think the shift from non-academic is important. I don't think people realize just how unpopular a lot of these things are, whether it's de-emphasizing achievement, detracking, all of that. Whether it's a lot of the DEI stuff, and you saw like a lot of the Democrats were happy to see the Trump administration, frankly, do some of their dirty work for them to address some of those issues. The problem is they haven't pivoted to anything. They haven't pivoted to academics. They haven't pivoted to, okay, we're going to get serious about accountability. In fact, they're sort of gutting some of the things that we need to do that. And they've done all of this stuff in a really sort of ham-handed, ham-fisted way that's just causing just a lot of chaos. And their agenda is in some ways actually stalled. We should talk more later about Nikki's point about executive orders, which is an important one. They're not getting a lot done in a durable way. And meanwhile, lots of chaos, overreach, and confusion. I think from their perspective, yeah, they'd agree with Bob that they've dominated the news cycle. Everyone's reacting to them, and that's the style of politics they want to have. And so I guess from their perspective, that's working. If your perspective is you want to see like constructive things happen on policy, that's a great set of politics for them. It's not really a good set of politics if you want to see anything done. And I think also from their perspective, they're probably surprised how quickly they brought everybody to heel. It's been a little alarming how quickly you had people who, 6 months ago were ride or die with Ibram Kendi and now are saying we shouldn't use the word diversity. So they have to feel good about that. I don't think that's a good thing, but they have to feel good about that. But I think they're paying a price for all this. Their polling is not good. I would caution it wasn't good at the beginning of the first Trump administration either, and he got himself reelected in 2024. And so, like, I think anyone who counts him out on that is foolish. But the polling's not good. I don't think people signed up for change, and in many ways he had a modest mandate for change, but I think what they've done has gone way beyond that, and there's going to be a price. People did not sign up for this level of sort of chaos and dysfunction. And even where people agree with their goals, we can come back and talk more about that with like IES and so forth. You're hard pressed to find anybody who wants to defend the methods for how they're doing it.
Yeah. So Mike, let me hit you with this question, and the next question is the flip side of it. So first, what has the Trump administration gotten right in the first 100 days?
Yeah, look, very little from my perspective. I mean, I agree with Bob and Nikki. They've been busy. And look, the old saying, right? Even a blind squirrel finds an acorn every once in a while. So there's a few things they've done that I've been happy about. Andy mentioned the CTE thing. They've fixed something on the charter school front. Look, I'm happy that the craziness of the DEI regime that we all lived through, through the 2010s into the early 2020s, seems to be over. And to the extent that the administration has helped, kind of put that in its grave, then that's a good thing. But is any of this going to be lasting? And when are we going to start talking about the stuff that really matters to kids' future, in my opinion, which is whether they can read and write and do math, what happened to an agenda around academic achievement? And
so let me pause you there, and let's use that to flip to the other question.
Yeah.
So Mike, let's have you first up on the next question, which is, what do you think the administration has gotten wrong? What gives you pause about their efforts?
Well, so many things. I mean, first of all, when it comes to the culture war stuff, I have been convinced by some of the people on this panel that I shouldn't just dismiss it as unimportant. That, for example, Steve Wilson's made this great and somber case that many of our best charter schools in this country were fundamentally changed in the 2010s when they bought into the Ibram Kendi stuff in a way that did enormous damage to the agenda around closing achievement gaps, raising expectations. So I understand that it matters. So we are hoping for the good guys to win in these fights, whether it's within charter schools, within traditional public school systems, within Harvard. We want the people who are fighting for high expectations, for liberalism, for free speech to win. And I do worry that the ham-handedness of the way the administration has done some of these fights may end up leading to yet another cycle of backlash. In other words, maybe they've empowered some of the bad guys instead of the good guys. All right, totally separate. They've done some things that are completely ridiculous, right? I don't know why anybody thinks it was a good idea to go in and blow up the Institute for Educational Sciences. It's just inexplicable. And again, nobody can explain it because it doesn't make any sense. It would be at the bottom of anybody's list for a target for what you want to go after at the Department of Education. It might be the one function that most, even conservatives, could agree. Data, research, sure, that sounds good. Reform it, okay, but burn it to the ground. That doesn't make any sense. And then look, this is not education, but this is what's going to really matter, I think, to education is starting a tariff, doing the trade war, all the tariffs, most likely pushing us into recession, according to the economists. This is going to do enormous damage to children, to families, to schools. This is not a controversial thought. Recessions are bad, and they're especially bad for kids. And so I think we're going to see a lot of pain and suffering in the next few years that was completely unnecessary.
Andy, what have they gotten wrong? You touched on some of this before. Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick up on I mean, quietly, you didn't have too many people actually defending IES. People thought it was ripe for reform and that was overdue. But the way they did it, you're hard pressed to find anybody who is defending that, even people who are very sympathetic to radically changing the federal role in education research, because it was so haphazard. They cut stuff that was really important, stuff that they actually said was a priority, and then they had to go back and try to fix it. So it's disorganized. I guess the other thing I'll just pick up on, we're not getting rid of DEI. That is not what's happening. We're replacing a toxic and coercive DEI of the left with a toxic and coercive DEI of the right. That is what's going on. And I think it behooves people who actually are liberals, to Mike's point, to stand up on that. Just because, like, the side that they're on is now winning and is in power, these sort of vague dictates that even courts are saying, I mean, it's important to note, per Nikki's point, these EOs are getting caught up in court because courts are like, well, this is too vague. They're like, I mean, you find lots of people who think Harvard had huge problems with viewpoint discrimination, with lack of viewpoint diversity, with free speech issues and so forth, but are aghast at the government coming in and trying to say, now we're going to tell you how to do that. And if they were serious about sort of resetting and actually leaning in, that, they put out this executive order that they were for free speech, and then like immediately started taking acts that are at odds not only with the culture of free speech, but in some cases arguably with the First Amendment. That's the problem here. And I think that's so in terms of what's not going well, we're not getting anything in terms of what we were offered. We're just getting a whole new set of things. So they're not de-weaponizing the federal government. They're just weaponizing against people they don't like. They're not restoring free speech. They're just changing who they think should have free speech rights. And again, that's not sustainable politically in this country over time. And there's going to be a price to be paid for it.
Bob, what gives you pause about what the administration has done thus far?
Several things give you pause. And the first one is something that no one has mentioned, and that is this. I don't think that Secretary McMahon and her team have been given the opportunity and operational space to do what they need to do. And by that, I mean, there has been so much coming out of the executive office of the president in terms of EOs, directives, demands on her and her staff, that they have not been able to execute on a plan, an agenda that addresses many of the issues that have been brought up in the last few minutes. She has an excellent team around her. They know what they're doing. Many of them have very deep backgrounds in education policy, in the federal government, state government, and they need the operational space to affect the agenda, to affect the plan. And that just hasn't, I just get the impression that they have not had that opportunity. And for my, for my friends in the administration, I would encourage them to allow them to do it. But because I think if you let Linda do it, you're going to see much more productive action than you've seen in the last several months. In terms of actual policy actions, I agree. IES is puzzling to me. I do believe that there is a plan to reform and improve IES. I do not see this as a walk away from the federal data collection and analysis effort. They understand the importance in the nation's report card. A few other items concern me, and that is this notion that you can simply slot the federal student loan program in any other office or department of the government. There's a high legal bar there, and some of the statutory authorities that I've seen referenced in connection with that idea, I'm not persuaded are legally valid. And then the last, I think, issue that concerns me is not so much concerns me, but it's a marked difference in approach and how they are approaching two different but interrelated issues, and that is their Title VI anti-Semitism enforcement efforts and their Title IX sex discrimination, gender identity enforcement efforts. There's a marked difference there we can talk about later, which I find to be very interesting, and I frankly have found the latter, the Title IX enforcement effort, to be, I think, will be more effective in the long run, at least for now, than the Title VI enforcement action.
Nikki, what's giving you pause first 100 days?
So I think the RIFs, the reduction in force, has not been perfectly executed, perhaps a little bit hasty and overbroad. Right. And I mean, like, let's think about so we have OCR, we have, there are the directed investigations that the department wants to do. And those are really hard to do when you just don't physically have enough human beings with pulses in the building to do that. So I think that's one concern. Because let's bear in mind, they're obviously also being sued from the outside multiple times a day. So there's just a real bandwidth problem there. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Harvard was mismanaged. And so
the university or the investigation?
The letter, right? I mean, there was the New York Times article, right, where it was sent, perhaps a draft was sent. I know we're all supposed to say art of the deal. As much as I would like to think that this was part of a grand plan, I don't know if it was. And they have done basically the impossible, which is to make Harvard a victim. What? Are you kidding me? They're like the worst actors of all time, going back 100 years, right? I mean, and so for them to suddenly be sympathetic, that is a really difficult feat. And I think that's like an unforced error. I am also pretty nervous, right, in the zeal to persecute Harvard, because I mean, I was joking earlier this week. I feel like we're in a 90s gang war right now. This is the Bloods and the Crips. But it is now it's down to a matter of honor, right? And neither side is going to acquiesce. Nobody's backing down. And that really actually panics me, because there is no happy resolution. I mean, just from a straight legal standpoint, you're in DMAS and then you're in the First Circuit. This is something nobody wants this fight right now. This is I'm very nervous about how the Harvard thing ends up getting resolved. But in their zeal, I mean, as people have pointed out, okay, it's not just Title VI, losing funding through that. There are all these other levers, right? There's the foreign students and there's the tax status. I mean, I am old enough to remember the lowest learner thing. I'm really nervous about this tax status thing. This is not the kind of thing, fight that we want to be having. I think it's really ugly and kind of childish.
And lowest learner, this was IRS.
Right. Yes, the IRS, making sure that the
administration.
conservative groups didn't get their tax status a couple years ago. And I do, and I don't see it coming from the admin as much. I see it kind of more coming from the activists, but I think there is an incentive to let's own the libs and let's sort of exact retribution. And I kind of see this coming, into tension with, all right, do we actually want to shrink the size and scope of government, shrink the size and scope of the department, right? I mean, what did Grover Norquist say, the size to drown it in a bathtub? But, then we see, I mean, even is are we going to use the grant? There are people who want to use the grant programs now to well, we'll just fund our programs because they funded DEI grant programs before. no, guys, like none of the money shouldn't be coming into the feds to start with and being doled out with strings attached, period. But I think, there is still then that tension. Okay, like let's send it all back to the states. We all watched, with the ESSER funds that were sent to the states during COVID. I mean, a lot of states pissed that money away on terrible projects. And so I worry about, if and when stuff gets offshore to the states, even, I mean, aside from moving the federal functions of the department, are the states even prepared for that? I don't know. And so I think there's been a lot of it feels a little bit like abortion where it's like, let's move stuff to the states, and the states are like, oh my gosh, what? And so I sort of see that happening as well. And I don't know if anybody has really like thought four steps on the chessboard as much as we're supposed to say, art the deal.
All right.
Well, I think,
One more
Rick, that's an
question I want to
important.
ask each of you, and then we're going to go to grading. Andy, do you want to jump in there real quick?
I just think that's a really important point Nikki's making. Like, I think everybody throws around like art of the deal, art of the comeback as like throwaway lines, but this is actually how they operate. And, as you think about like this stuff, most of the stuff is multi-round games. You have to figure out how to work with people, how to do things in a durable way. But that's not sort of Trump's art of the deal. Everything's a one-round game, and that works if you're in real estate and you do some of the things he's done. It doesn't work in foreign policy. It doesn't work particularly well in domestic policy. And so I just want to pause on that because I think like it can sound when you have a panel like this, like it's like a throwaway, but it's actually a really important point in terms of understanding how they operate. And then some people like it, but I think a lot of people, and you're hearing a lot of that on this panel from different perspectives, think it's just a really poor match for actually governing.
We've got a lot on the table, and I want to have a chance to dig into all this. So, but one question I want to ask, if you guys can give a short response, that's great. Nikki, what has surprised you the most about the first 100 days?
So I am a recovering libertarian. I actually don't know how the government works. All I do is throw stones from the side. And so it has been really fun to like have some friends on the inside and sort of learn. In my mind, everybody in like the White House, they're all having lunch together in the White House, mess together. Turns out that's not happening whatsoever. And so I have kind of been surprised to realize that, I mean, outside groups like Bob's, like mine, like have actually like a significant role to play in sort of helping to move things along. I mean, this is also, a White House that kind of governs by like what is on TV too. And so while we have friends who are trying to move things through the agency, internally, and then things get watered down or, sidetracked, literally you can go on TV and be like, I think we should blank. And like, then suddenly that's like an edict coming from on high. And that is kind of fascinating to me because I think I mean, like I lament like what must it have been like to work like under like in the Reagan White House or in like the Bush 43 White House, like when things were like a little bit more linear. Um, and so that has been kind of fascinating. It's just like it's like a whole new style of policymaking in addition to sort of like the maelstrom of activity.
Bob, what surprised you most?
I'm really struck by how earnest the president, his team, and Secretary McMahon have been in their desire to really to dismantle the Department of Education and to reorganize and reduce the size of the agency. I mean, a 50% RIF. I never thought I would see that. Was it prudent? Not so sure about that. I still don't know where all the cuts were made. I am concerned about IES. I do know that the cuts in the Office of the General Counsel were very deep, and which gives me great pause and concern. But just the strong effort to close down that department through the RIF and the desire to do it and actually take action to execute on that has surprised me because usually this is just campaign rhetoric that you hear and it's forgotten the day after the election. That has not happened here.
Andy, most surprising.
I've been surprised they haven't had a better strategy with Congress and how disorganized that is. I mean, so again, like to this point that these EOs, they come and go and executive actions and so forth, that stuff's not durable. You would think they'd want to push an agenda with Congress, and they've sort of done the opposite. They've antagonized Congress, but given how they've done this and the DOJ stuff behind the scenes, Republicans are as frustrated with it as Democrats are. And so they've got this big agenda that they want to do. And they sort of, when they really lean in, they can bring Congress to heel, but that's going to be time limited, particularly as they fall in the polls. So I've been surprised. Like a more normal administration would have started on day one with a charm offensive, not sort of an assault on various people's priorities and things that are important to them back in their states and districts. And so that is really uh that has I don't think it's going to work for them. And it, like, I mean, like I'm not troubled that they're not getting like lots of their things through, but I'm just, as a matter of like craftsmanship, it seems like political malpractice, and it surprises me.
Mike, what
Yep.
surprised you?
Yeah, I'll say two things. First, Doge. I mean, I don't think any of us saw this coming, right? Until very recently. And, even when at the inauguration, I think most of us thought it was just going to be for show. We'd all been through this kind of thing before with attempts to cut funding. And so, what we watched Elon Musk and his crew do was very different than we've ever experienced. So that was a true surprise. Then I'll go with one pleasant surprise. I think a lot of us have been worried that this administration, talking about giving things back to the states, would issue some kind of blanket waiver around testing and accountability, waiving a lot of the ESSA requirements. It has not done that so far, knock on wood, as somebody who cares a lot about testing and accountability. And so I'm happy that so far that has not happened.
All
It's
right, I'm
only,
going to ask you
it's only
guys.
like 3:30 today though, Mike. So
I'm going to ask you guys to give a couple of grades on a couple of specific aspects of what we've seen so far, and then we're going to open this up. Mike, I'm going to start with you. How would you grade the administration's efforts on K-12 so far?
D.
Sentence of explanation, a comment?
I thought we're trying to get to the next step.
We are. Andy,
D,
K-12.
people voted for aspects of this, but not the chaos and the haphazard. And it's been said there's no pivot to academics. So D minus.
Bob,
Incomplete.
K-12, Nikki.
I'll be more generous. I'm going to go like B plus. I mean, watching a lot of the school districts really start to bend their knee on the DEI stuff, on the men and women's sports issue has been really surprising. I mean, I think people obviously are disincentivized by seeing what's happening in Maine. But even like I live in Northern Virginia, and to watch like the verklempt like sports parents versus like the state association is like fascinating to me.
Nikki, how would you grade them on higher ed?
Higher ed, I'm going to go with a C. I'm pretty worried about both like the Dear Colleague letter. Also, it is aspirational. I don't know if it's totally firmly grounded in legal theory. And then Harvard also, I think, continues to be a concern. They have this massive list of schools that they want to investigate. And like, I don't know, I just don't think they have enough people to do a good job, and they have to do a good job.
Bob, higher ed.
B.
Andy,
F. They're as illiberal as the people they're against, and like that's not going to solve anything.
That's just okay. We can talk about that.
Let's talk about that.
we'll come right back to that. Mike, higher ed.
Yeah, I'm on Team Andy here. I'd say F. I think this is a case where they really are black pilled, as Ross Duth said the other day, that this vision that these that our higher education institutions are just corrupt through and through, versus the fact that they've got some real issues, but they're also gems, and they're also such important pieces of our country and our competitive environment. And this broader war on research and the research enterprise and the biomedical research, and we're going to cut grants for cancer research in order to get back at the social studies departments. I don't know. F F F F.
And last grade, execution so far, kind of operational execution. Mike,
Yeah, here I'll take Bob's answer on incomplete. I mean, a lot of these EOs ask for something to be done, and they haven't been done yet. So, for example, I'm very curious about the disparate impact executive order. I think that could do some real good, but we got to see what regulations they put out on it. So, incomplete.
Andy, execution.
Yeah, same thing. Incomplete. They need to show that they can actually build. They're good at tearing things down, and their argument, which like there's some merit to their argument, is if you don't move fast, none of this will ever happen. But they're incomplete because can they actually put anything in behind this that's constructive? And so far, and we talked, Bob talked about the competent team, but a lot of them haven't been confirmed yet. They're stalled, and so it's a big incomplete.
Bob, execution.
Incomplete. They just have not had the time to consummate their actions. We can talk about that more later.
Nikki.
And I guess I'll also say incomplete. But I do, yeah, I think there have been some significant missteps that maybe didn't have to happen.
All right, Bob, I want to give you a chance to get back to this point. Andy has raised this critique that the administration, especially in higher ed, is simply displacing wokeism with right-wing wokeism, that it's equally a liberal. Wanted to share some thoughts on that.
Sure, I agree. That is a concern. You want to watch out for it, but let's face it. These elite institutions, and frankly, to some extent, the entire education establishment, certainly even the K-12 establishment, which is infected by radical teacher union politics, have their own illiberalism that needs to be purged from federally funded programs. And to the extent you've got critical race theory, critical gender theory permeating programs that are paid for by the taxpayers and violate civil rights law, and that's the key phrase, violate civil rights law, the Department of Education, the administration have every right and indeed a duty to attempt to root that out. In my mind, there are well-established procedures and policies on how to go about doing that. And the concern that I have is not the strategic goal, for which I would give them an A. It's the methods that they are pursuing in certain instances. So by way of illustration, with regard to Title IX, they appear to be using regular order. They're launching civil rights investigations out of the Office for Civil Rights at the Education Department in connection with Title IX Enforcement Authority. It's being conducted by the Education Department under supervision by senior political appointees there. They are following the well-established procedures for those investigations. And while they're moving those investigations quickly, they're following regular order. They're providing notice of the investigation. They're conducting the due diligence. They're allowing the institutions to respond, to provide evidence. And in a few instances, as regards to the Maine school system and the University of Pennsylvania, they have found violations and they are moving to enforcement proceedings. That is in marked contrast, I think, to what you're seeing in the Title VI anti-Semitism context, where there is a very well-publicized joint task force on anti-Semitism that has made very public demands on a number of universities, including Harvard. Nikki's already, artfully elucidated the errors there. And I think part of the problem, and frankly, to just to a great extent backfired. They've ended up with a lawsuit filed by Harvard against the administration. There is an argument that they're beginning to find sympathy in certain quarters as being victims of those who oppose academic freedom and campus free speech, which are those are the hats that we're supposed to be wearing. And so I think that there's something to be said about using these well-established procedures to enforce these civil rights laws because they prevent mistakes like that from being made.
Yeah, I would jump on that and say, like, the speed with which a lot of this has been conducted is, like, I find a little bit worrisome. If we watched the Biden administration go after University of Florida when Ben Sasse was running it, open, investigate, and like come to a finding in a matter of weeks, we'd be screaming bloody murder. And I think rightfully so. We are a nation of laws. We believe in due process. And I think, in this case, the Trump administration has known for a long time, the media is hostile. Like, they have to be Jackie Robinson. They have to be beyond flawless. They will be criticized for everything. So these investigations had to be perfect. They had to be bulletproof. And I don't think they are. And I think that because then it really undermines where they want to get to. I like where they want to get to, but I want it to be conducted perfectly.
There are folks inside the administration who would say this is all a double standard, that what they're doing is dusting off the playbook that was pioneered under Obama and Biden by folks at the Office of Civil Rights, that a strategy that was used on school discipline, on campus sexual assault, on gender identity. And the only reason there's complaints is because now it's on behalf of an agenda that the media doesn't like, that campuses don't like. Fair, is that a fair defense?
They
Is
would
there a
be they
problem
would
with
be
that
right.
defense?
They would be right to make that criticism. My response to that is yes. Now do it the right way. We are not them.
Yeah.
There are rules, there are procedures, follow them. They will protect you in the end. They will allow for you to make enduring change because the other side skipped those steps and look what happened to them. Look what happened to Joe Biden's student loan forgiveness policies. Totally, the regulations, the policies, totally shredded by the courts. That's a perfect example of when you skip proper rulemaking and you issue a mass student loan cancellation by press release, you end up in the courts and you lose. So my advice is don't skip the requisite steps. Follow the procedures that are long and well established. They will get you where you need to go. You just have to be patient. Policy making and investigations done out of impatience are a dangerous thing.
Hmm.
I would suggest that they need to avoid that.
Yeah, Bob and I agree there. I mean, look, the Biden and Obama teams were not great on due process on college campuses. So the response to that is not to not be good on due process. It's to say due process actually matters. And that's a troubling pattern with this administration, right? When you talk about immigration, you get an answer that like people who have been killed by people in this country illegally didn't have due process, which is just a non sequitur. That's not an argument if you're arguing about does due process matter. But I think like you have to step back. This stuff doesn't hold together on its own. Like, if you want to get rid of litmus tests, which they say they do, you can't then say, but we want these ones that the government wants, these conservative litmus tests. These institutions at some level have got to heal themselves. You're not hearing a lot of like robust defense that they were great. I think everybody agrees that there's lots of problems. The question is, do you want the government coming in there and doing that? And what does that look like? And especially doing it, as Mike said, in these like really heavy-handed ways that affect like all kinds of important research. So if these guys wanted to say we are going to vigorously enforce Title VI because that's important, we're going to do it in very specific ways with these investigations, I don't think you get huge arguments, but you're getting these very broad letters that keep going out to universities that are it's difficult to falsify. It's difficult to say, okay, here's what would be on the right side of this, the wrong side. It's as Bob said, it's just not these things are not happening in an appropriate way. They're not intended to. This is shock and awe. And they're trying to send a message, and that's a problem. And it's illiberal. And again, I just don't think I don't understand how you say like you had all this illiberalism on the left, which absolutely, I mean, well, some people would disagree. I'm not gonna disagree with that. But you don't solve that by then saying now we're gonna have the right wing version of this, and that is what's happening, and it's a big problem.
Mike, you mentioned the black pill analogy a moment ago. And there are certainly those on the right whose response to this conversation is, look, these institutions are rotten through and through. They're ideological, they're politically active. It's not a problem if we burn them down, if we wreck them. Um, do they have a point? Is that what would you say to help folks who've kind of like are hearing that strategy? How should they be thinking about the first 100 days and what it portends?
Right. No, and I think that you said it very well, Rick. And look, I don't. I mean, I consider myself a Burkean conservative. Okay. So I come into this being skeptical of any time somebody says that revolution, true revolution, off with their heads is what we need, right? Because I think a reading of history is that that has been very dangerous over time. And so that's why I'm someone who believes much more in reform than in actual revolution. And I think that some of the beliefs and statements about those institutions, are exaggerated. There's problems. I mean, like I said before, I acknowledge that the Kendyism stuff that happened was bad, and it was bad for ed reform, which is what I know better than the higher ed stuff. But doesn't mean that it was everywhere. It doesn't mean that those institutions, are terrible through and through, right? I mean, because the people at KIPP at one time said we're not going to say work hard, be nice, it doesn't mean we should give up on the charter schools movement, which serves 3 million kids, right? We got to keep things in perspective. So I think we just have to that we have to start as conservatives, in my opinion, from a place of gratitude. We inherited institutions, some of which work really well. I would say, like the US military, some of which are definitely in need of much reform, like the public education system. But we need to be careful about destroying that inheritance. And I think the Chris Rufos of the world are not careful enough. And so, yeah, I just disagree fundamentally. And look, I also had, you asked this question about the government coming in. This is about the federal government. Those of us on the right are supposed to believe that when possible, let's let people at the state or local level try to solve these problems and come up with solutions that might be different from place to place. We also tend to believe that these decisions, when we do want to make a decision at a national level, ideally that should be made by Congress.
Nikki, Mike we're just talking about the higher ed piece. There's also, as several of you mentioned, the degree to which Doge cut the department, the extent of the rifts. It was certainly a surprise to me. I think the activity, the extent of it, the speed of it surprised a lot of us. How should we think about that? If you look back on the first 100 days, was this them doing some, wrenching surgery right off the bat, a smart move to do a reset? Do you have qualms about how and why they focused on cutting the department? How are you thinking that through?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any visibility into how the cuts were made. I have heard rumors that maybe Doge was not totally in line with what Ed wanted, and so there might have been a little bit of friction there. That being said, like I do, as I devolve into a neocon, I like shock and awe. Like it definitely got people's attention, right? And so that was good. It's funny because I have had conversations at home with my husband who works at Cato, and he was like, what's to stop the next, Democrat administration from coming in and just saying, we're rehiring 4,000 people, right? I mean, it's all well and good to cut the jobs, but how do we keep it from coming back? Right? Like what was this enough of a surgery that we got out kind of all of the metastatic like cells, or like what's the plan going forward? I don't know. I want the cuts to stick. I don't think they were smart. I think about when in like 2007, 2008, in the Republic of Georgia, the new president came in, he was a conservative. He fired every single police officer in the country. And then made them all reapply for their jobs. And everybody at the time was like, oh, it's going to be total, lawless awfulness. It actually wasn't. And the people who ended up rehiring, like they were good. And like, it is kind of my hope that will happen with some of like, the data stuff. Like obviously, the feds are collecting too much information, right? We have all heard for years about the amount of compliance time that LEAs and SEAs have to spend just sending stuff in to Ed, and then who is analyzing it? Is it being analyzed? Like, and so some of that definitely had to be scaled back. Was it done intentionally, wisely from the beginning? No. But I do think that right, I mean, because also aside from the rifts, there also was the problem of just getting people into the department, appointees in. I mean, PPO was a real like stumbling block. Like it slowed a lot of people down. And so for a while, like there were like 4 lawyers for the whole department. And so I think that now there are more people. I hope that we'll get to sort of a more regular process. I guess it can't be worse.
Andy, there's been news about how the cuts at IES affected NAEP, the post-secondary data collections, which are relevant given what Congress is trying to do on student loan repayment. How big a deal is this really? Were there serious missteps or these minor missteps that have been blown up?
It's a big deal. And as I said, their theory of the case was you couldn't wait, you had to do this. And I feel like it's important for people to engage with that theory of the case rather than there's been a lot of hysteria. And they basically said like a lot of this stuff we don't need. Now there's 2 ways to think about your question though. One is, okay, politically, and I do think, and we've talked about this, Rick, there's a long fuse on this stuff. And so like I don't expect to see people like riled up for the 2026 election because a bunch of contracts at DC-based research shops were canceled. That's just not how it's going to work. But over time, we're going to miss some of this stuff. And it's important. It's important basic research. It's data. It helps with analytics. And I think I mean, this is the thing. They could have done this. They could have said, we are going to reorient this in some different directions. We're going to do it in a planful way. We're going to wind down these. Do not expect these contracts to continue. Like there's ways you could have done that. Their argument, in fairness, is if we did that, then special interests would gather and they'd fight it off. But like special interest gathering and fighting it off, we have a word for that. It's called democracy. That's just the way the process works, as frustrating as it is, and the process is designed to work slowly and to have that. And so I raised that just to say, I think substantively, we're going to see an effect of this over time. It is a big deal. I think it'll actually affect some of the president's own priorities, things he says he wants to do. You need this kind of data and information. I mean, NAPE has been sort of spared. It took a little bit of a haircut, but I don't think people would realize the extent to which a number of states that you wouldn't think, so Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, are just hitting the cover off the ball on reading. You wouldn't know that without this data. And so over time, there's going to be a price, but it's slow and not visible. I don't think it's going to have sort of huge political implications in the near term. Other parts of education might, like the student loan stuff, I think has a much shorter fuse and could be more politically visible, but a lot of this stuff will take a while to manifest itself.
I also think that the department's going to take quick action to fill out IES in the way within the administration's vision. I don't think it's a static situation where contracts are going to stay canceled and there's not going to be, activity. I do think that there are folks who are senior in the department who understand its importance and will take action to remediate the situation.
Should they be doing a more, should they be working harder to communicate that message out
Yes.
to
Yes, they should. And you raised this issue. One thing that I was surprised to see was recently this president signed 6 executive orders on education in one day, basically at one time. I don't know why you wouldn't take each of those issues and make an event around each of these issues, because there was some good stuff in those orders. And much like they did with closing down the department, which I thought was just, a fairly brilliant way of having the children come in at the desks and the president sign an order, all the kids sign the order, the EO. They seem to be giving up opportunities to make their point, to communicate to the public why they are doing X, Y, Z. And I just think that's unfortunate, because there's a good case to be made for a lot of these policy directives that are coming out of the Oval Office, and they're just being lost in the shuffle.
we got a bunch of questions piled up. Well, let me try to get some of these in. One, what consequences will Trump's use of executive power in ed have for future administrations?
I think the
Yeah,
next
look,
president is going to, we are on a bad path here. This idea that the president, convenes in the Oval Office at 4 o'clock and issues orders is absolutely crazy. And is not in any way like how government's intended to work. And I think the next president is going to have to reintroduce restraint by being very visible about how they do that, and not only talk about the things they're doing, talk about the things they're not doing, and resist the temptation to come in on the first day and be like, I'm going to issue a bunch of executive orders because my predecessor did. There was always a few of these. So on abortion, a few other things the president would sign on inauguration day, and it was sort of symbolic with the different parties' priorities. But this is absolutely next level. The founders would throw up if they saw this. And so I think it's going to be really important, because you don't want this to boomerang back and forth. We're seeing that on Title IX with the sexual assault guidelines, and now some of the stuff on gender. We saw it on student loans. Like, this is not a good way. Whatever you think about these issues, the merits of these various issues, this isn't just a good way to make policy. And so the next president's going to have a big job to reset that.
But let's establish what the EO does. The EO is a policy directive from the president to the executive branch on what the policy of the president is, what the policy of the administration is, and you are to act accordingly. That's all it is. It's not binding on outside actors. They can be very important, but it's a directive to the government. And so and I agree. There have been an excessive number of them, and as I said, the good ones get, there's some good points being made with the, public relations points being made with these EOs, and those points are being lost because there's so many. But that's all they are. They're just a directive to the administration on what you're supposed to do.
And
Yeah.
Bob, do you
Well, I think no,
feel
I think that's, I'm sorry, I think that's like they're targeting law firms with these.
Well, that's a different
They're
issue.
targeting
That
individuals. I think it's like the extent of these exact. I think it's a little. You
I
can't just say these are just. These things are having an effect, and this is just we have not seen government operate like this and the executive branch operate like this. And I worry if you've sort of followed politics over the last like 20, 30 years, every escalation's been met with a new escalation, right?
I-
And so this is alarming.
that is a valid concern. I was talking about the education context and not
Right. Okay.
non-education matters.
Mike, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm pretty much with Bob that a lot of these are just press releases, so let's not get too worked up about them, right? You call it an EO, other people call it a press release or a policy speech. But look, let's take it up a level. I mean, the only way we get out of this pattern is if one of the parties can win a significant congressional majority and govern. And Andy said 20 or 30 years. It's been a long time since either party acted like it wanted to be the governing party, right? Is it Yuval Levine or maybe Jonah who talks a lot about that? We've got two minority parties, and that's a real problem, And so here we are, 100 days in. The administration is extremely unpopular, way underwater with independent voters, not acting like Trump at least cares if the Republican Party is popular and wins over more votes and wins a bigger congressional majority going forward, right? What we need is one of the parties to decide it actually wants to win elections, more like by 55% and has maybe a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. Given our system right now and the way the Senate is, it's more likely that that could be the Republican Party, but it's not acting right now like it wants to be that governing party.
I agree with Mike on that. I'd also just add a pin to it, like whatever the composition of Congress is and how many seats either party has in the Senate or the House, Congress just needs to do its job. Like it's stunning how many of these issues are just downstream from Congress's inability to pass laws. And then when they do pass laws that are clearly written and don't invite like all this vagueness that ends up creating all these issues. And I mean, it's the first article for a reason. So I don't think like as a citizen, this is too much to ask for. And we are like, and I think we just, you can't sort of divorce a lot of this dysfunction from just Congress can't. I mean, we were talking about IES earlier. One reason people are frustrated, they haven't been able to reauthorize IES for decades now. Like all the federal statutes are behind on being reauthorized. I just don't think you can divorce any of this from that problem.
Well, I think it's remarkable how little discussion of Congress there has been in this conversation, right? It's just the Article One power seems to be completely missing from the entire discussion.
I mean, but we have seen them basically abdicate their responsibility, right? They are scared to get out over their skis right now. And I don't use the scared word lightly. I mean, I think there has been a real reticence for anyone in either chamber to take a lead, unless it is, I mean, what we have seen like resolutions introduced to extend term limits. I mean, Jesus, what are we doing right now? Like as opposed to actually like getting things done. And it's so funny. I mean, I keep trying to remind our activists, my donors, don't hang your mission accomplished sign just because there are these EOs. Like, actually, now it's like the hard work begins, right? There has to be legislation to codify this stuff. There has to be rulemaking. And I fail to see anybody in Congress that would like agree to move anything forward that is not something that has been like gotten like the benediction of the White House.
Well,
And
that
on
would
the
be the first
subject,
test.
on the subject of the RIFs, I just want to mention someone who raised this issue before. I mean, if a Democrat comes back into office in 2029, those positions would simply be refilled. The appropriation still exists. The authorization still exists. So it would be a lot of, blood on the floor for very little reason in the long term.
Let's talk about Article 3 for a moment. We've got a question here, with the sanctions against universities, how much further can we expect the administration to go before courts intervene? We've obviously seen litigation in the case of the DEI. There were 3 injunctions last week. how's this going to play out in court? Does the administration have a strong hand in a lot of this litigation? How's this going to play out?
I think the suits that have been filed have been brought in strategic jurisdictions, right? Like you don't coincidentally pick the Northern District of California and SDNY because you think you're like it's like totally impartial, right? Like they're forum shopping, both sides do it. The nationwide injunctions, like I think we're sort of spinning towards a crisis where that is going to have to be shut down at some point. And so I think there are so many sort of other tangential things. I think, as we were talking before though, with even governing with Congress, I mean, I worry that this total dysfunction is going to lose Republicans the Senate in the midterms. And I mean, I want 4 years of judges. I don't want 2 years. I want 4 years. And so I don't think we're going to get that because they have shown that like neither party can govern their way out of a paper bag.
Well, and it's specifically, you guys, have talked a bunch about kind of the ambition of the EOs, and maybe they haven't been crafted as carefully as they could be. Are you concerned that on, say, the DEI litigation, that on the Harvard litigation, that the administration is on weak legal footing, or how do you kind of
I'm not
handicap what we're talking?
concerned by that. But I
Or
think
are you,
I
I
think
guess,
they are, and I
who do
think
you regard them as?
courts are already starting to say that. It's just too vague. It's too like if you want again, if you want to come in and say you need to follow Title VI, like I mean, you're gonna get some hardcore ideologues who are gonna fight you, but most people are like, yeah, that makes sense. But these things they're written too vaguely, they're written too broadly. So already like some of the stuff at Harvard, courts are saying no, you can't like just hold on to all these funds. Some of it is stuff that like Congress is appropriate and they don't have the authority to claw back. And so I mean, the administration, what they're doing is they're pushing as hard as they can on every front to see what sticks. And look, let's be people like us pay attention. It's the average person doesn't pay attention. And frankly, the average person probably sees and is like, oh yeah, they're doing what they said they were going to do. They're fighting. But like
And
this
I
is
hate Harvard.
a
Good thing.
problem. Sorry?
And I hate Harvard. It's a good
Right. Yeah.
thing.
These are not sympathetic. Yeah. Trump, you have to give him like credit where it's due. He's very smart about the political targets he picks.
Absolutely.
He
But
has a
I want to go back
uncanny
to this
knack
point I
for
made
it.
before, which is there are procedures to enforce Title VI. There's procedures to enforce Title IX. If they would use those procedures, develop their record, follow the due process in those procedures, they would be in a much better place with Harvard, whoever they're going after, than they are now. And a failure to use, or I should say, the decision not to use those procedures is coming back to haunt them now. How is this going to be corrected? I don't know. Again, contrast this with what they're doing in Title IX, where they appear to be following regular order, developing those records, and then moving to enforce either administratively or through litigation. They're going to be a much better footing in those cases.
And I assume, Nikki would know better, I guess, is on K-12 that the DEI stuff, they're on very firm ground when they say to, say, a Chicago public schools, you should not be doing a program that is only for Black boys. If that's literally not open to other kids, that's a problem. I would think when they try to get into the curricular issues about how the schools are teaching history and the like, there's so many prohibitions on the federal government getting involved in that stuff that seems to be easily tossed aside by any
But
judge.
that's the point, right, Mike? There's no limiting principle here. They're not actually against the federal government getting involved in the curriculum. They're only against it getting involved in ways they don't like. And like
Yeah.
we have to get back to like let's have some first principles
Mhm.
that we can actually adhere to and not just have them be situational based on who's in power.
But there are laws against that, right? The federal government shall not dot dot dot. So
All right, last question. Um, January 2029. How much of what we've seen so far is going to stick? Or asked another way, kind of what's the most important thing we've seen so far, when we look back from January 2029?
the most important thing is the recession and has caused great damage to families and schools.
Andy?
On that happy note. Uh I think it's a hard question to answer. I think it's a fantastic question. We are downstream of an intense amount of frustration with public authorities coming out of the pandemic. I think we're just beginning to reckon with this. You've heard Rahm Emanuel basically say Democrats should apologize for some of the school closure decisions and move on. That's advice I tried to give a few years ago, that like I think people underestimate just how frustrated people were and are, and how that continues to infuse our politics. And so I think it's a very fluid time. This feels very late, sort of 19th century to me, and that we're going to be redefining the parties. I mean, it's fascinating. You have people on this panel, Democrats and Republicans, who are all like, what is Trump doing? Because he's sort of operating in a whole different direction. So I think like it's a very difficult time question to answer, because it is the most fluid time in politics in any of our lifetimes.
It just events that there's going to be some event that we cannot predict that will dictate how we are in January 2029. All the stuff we're talking about now will likely be on the back burner by then.
Nikki, last word.
I think we're going to have 4 years of basically like the back of the DEI movement being broken, right? This is not like Title IX at the end of the first Trump administration, where it was like they had a couple months and they were just going to wait it out and flip things when Biden came into office. There are 4 years of the DEI people know that like there will be investigations. This will not be over quickly. You will not enjoy this, right? I mean, so I think that there are a non-zero number of administrators at K to 12 and higher ed that kind of secretly want this to end, like the tyranny and the DEI administrators just to like end. And they can point to Trump and say he's the boogeyman, he made us do it. But I think there's a real sense of relief. And so I think we are going to start to move past the identity politics moment in time, which is a huge relief because I want to retire and day drink.
On that happy, I like it. Hey,
Obsession.
thanks all of you for making the time. I mean, I've said, it's felt like 4 years already, and we're only 100 days in, so a lot to digest. So thanks so much for helping us do that. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We'll look forward to having you with us soon. Until then, thanks much. I'm Rick Hess.
Thanks, Rick.